It doesn't spread, it's not contagious, it doesn't meet Farr's law, it's not equally distributed between the sexes. It only occurs decades after, quote, some so-called infection by a factor or cofactor. That's all incompatible with an infectious disease.
Although cofactors are being considered, even by Gallo and the others, there is still no hint or suggestion from the AIDS establishment that the HIV hypothesis has failed. Not only does the AIDS establishment refuse to fund other hypotheses, they have refused to conduct a critically controlled experiment that would either prove or disprove HIV. As we've seen, the major scientific publications won't even publish a letter suggesting that it should be done.
That study has never been done, even all this time after all this money has been spent.
Dr. Thomas explains this experiment would match persons from risk groups like homosexuals, IV drug users, and hemophiliacs as identically as possible.
You need a group of people who are HIV positive and a group of people who are HIV negative. And then you have to let time go by and see which group dies fastest and of what diseases. Most importantly, you have to take cognizance of drug consumption and the alloantigen effect, being the recipient of foreign proteins in multiple infections. But when all of these things are taken under consideration, why, then you can see whether HIV has any effect.
That would be an experiment that would be very telling whether HIV is causing AIDS or not. You know. That's exactly what we discussed earlier. Can we identify a group of people who are not drug users, who are not at risk from intoxications by ACT and cocaine and nitrites and amphetamines just from HIV? If that could be shown, we would have made a major step in proving or disproving the HIV hypothesis, depending on the outcome of that study.
Tragically, this has all happened several times before, and it's not the first time that medical science ignored what was right in front of their face because they were obsessed with the belief that all diseases must be caused by some kind of a germ. In the late 1700s, scurvy, which is caused by a vitamin C deficient diet, was thought to be an infectious disease because it broke out among clusters of sailors on long ocean voyages. Quarantines failed, but when the British Navy began bringing limes aboard, scurvy vanished. Yet microbiologists continue to search for the germ they believe caused scurvy for another 100 years. During the 1920s, thousands of rural Americans came down with pellagra, a disease caused by a vitamin B niacin shortage. Joseph Goldberger, who was appointed by the U.S. Department of Health, discovered that pellagra was not infectious and the result of poor nutrition. Yet his medical research was completely ignored, and pellagra continued to afflict thousands of lives while researchers chased germs. Recently in Japan, a disease called SMAN left thousands paralyzed. It was caused by a drug taken for indigestion. When victims complained of the symptoms, the doctors prescribed even more of the drug. It took 10 years for the Japanese germ hunters to give up the search and then finally acknowledge the real cause of SMAN. This obsession with germs has continually had disastrous results.
It's a disgrace for any other disease with this much disagreement about the cause. We would by now have a balanced portfolio of alternative propositions. The NIH would be out there calling for proposals having to do with those kinds of things that are known to cause immunosuppression, which are not related to viral causality. That's only prudent. Why we're not doing that is a question that really needs to be asked by the public press, and which is not being asked.
Why isn't the media addressing this concern? How does the Group for Reappraisal rate the media's performance?
Deplorable. Deplorable. I can't understand why the media have behaved the way they have. For example, if a politician were to give a handout to the media, why, they would tear it apart with criticism. But somebody from the NIH hands out an equivalent document to the standard media, and they swallow it line and sinker and don't question it at all. They don't even seek a dissenting opinion. I think that their overall performance has been a great disservice to the American people.
Attempts to present interviews with Peter Duesberg in the major news media have met with strong opposition from Fauci and the AIDS establishment, and they are often canceled. But the issue is not going away, and the argument against HIV is raging on radio talk shows, newspapers, and thought-provoking programs like Tony Brown's Journal. Finally, in 1993, ABC's news magazine Day One became the first major network expose to question HIV and the AIDS establishment. After asking some tough questions, reporter John Hockenberry and the producers were reprimanded by Anthony Fauci and the AIDS establishment.
I know that from the producer, Regus, and so he told me there were already calls from Anthony Fauci. You're risking the nation's health and big health issues at stake. It's not only money, it's not just entertainment. People are dying. And this kind of intimidation, it's happening to the reporters just as much as to scientists. If they don't conform, they won't keep their job as the AIDS reporter. An AIDS reporter who had once said HIV is not causing AIDS would not be invited to the next AIDS conference by Fauci or by Bill Paul or Gallo or David Baltimore or David Ho. He would be at home and watching television while it's doing. So he wouldn't have a column to report from the meeting or when he comes back, and he wouldn't be in the loop any longer.
Writer Celia Farber, who has covered the HIV debate for years, is often harassed by AIDS activists like Martin Delaney.
I think science journalists have utterly betrayed people with HIV and AIDS by basically making their sources the powers that be. I mean, they just did not question anything.
Even Hollywood has become part of the act. Films, TV dramas, soap operas, and tabloid talk shows spread the fear of HIV and AIDS. Stars and public figures wear red ribbons, appear at fundraising events, and head AIDS research drives. Exploiting the HIV/AIDS myth has become quite profitable for film and television companies and has had a tremendous effect on the public perception. Even Congress, which has funded the Titanic AIDS budget, has expressed little concern for scientific integrity.
The Congress, like any political body or any politician, need not worry about what reality is, only the perception of reality. Scientists, on the other hand, it's their job to be concerned about what reality really is.
Representative Gil Gutenecht, who dared to ask if HIV might not be what causes AIDS, soon found himself embroiled in controversy with HIV proponents and the huge government-funded research institutions. In a letter to Anthony Fauci, Gutenecht presented 12 questions that challenged the validity of the HIV hypothesis and our national AIDS program.
After 4 months, the response came back from Donna Shalala in a letter that was fraught with prevaricated assertions, undocumented claims, and statements that are false. Indeed, it was more political than scientific. As for the actual proof HIV causes AIDS, she cited prospective and retrospective cohort studies in San Francisco and Africa that have shown that HIV causes AIDS. Concerning AZT, again, scientific studies have shown that AZT benefits patients who have AIDS as well as HIV infection. And as for using tax dollars to provide AZT, she says, failure to make this treatment available to HIV-infected pregnant women or other individuals with HIV disease would be unethical. Obviously, the health department has no intent of changing their position. Gutenecht says, when these questions are raised, conspiracy of silence is deafening, especially among the scientific community. Gutenecht believes that this issue needs to be resolved among scientists. But why hasn't it? After 12 years, the AIDS establishment has been unwilling and unable to prove HIV causes AIDS and disputed all other causes. The reason? It's a case of the fox watching the henhouse, says Peter Duesberg, who explains that the public is not aware that our enormous AIDS program is being controlled by a small monopoly of government scientists, scientists who are protecting their own vested interests above honest research.
These are review panels set up by professionals, but the professionals are not without vested interest. These are essentially juries that are set up, selected by the establishment, and people who are already funded by the establishment, who are unlikely to consider an alternative. These are not free juries, these are juries with vested interest.